Today we're going to be talking about evolved human behaviours. And in this topic, we're going to be looking at a thing called evolved psychological mechanisms, human ethology, mental modules, and then we'll have a bit of a sum up at the end. So in this lecture, we'll be looking at human evolved psychological mechanisms and how evolutionary psychologists go about studying them. Now, evolved psychological mechanisms are human behavioural tendencies that enabled our evolutionary ancestors to survive in an ever-changing natural environment. Now, these tendencies have been passed down to us through our ancestral DNA. Our DNA contains instructions for constructing and maintaining our bodies and brains. This includes the neural networks that produce our behavioural tendencies, and each behaviour has its own neural network. Our behaviour in any given situation is a combined product of our evolved psychological mechanisms and the things that we have learned since birth. So it's not all innate, it's not all instinct. There is an instinctual element to it. However, there's very little part of our inherited behavioural tendencies that aren't modifiable by life experience. Evolutionary psychologists regard human beings as a species of life that has evolved on Earth alongside all other species. In other words, they don't regard us as being special in terms of coming from another planet or being above the animals or different from the animals. We're just another animal. However, we're an animal that has evolved capacities that we haven't discovered in any other animal yet. And the psychologists use the same approach to studying humans that they would any other species. The most reliable way to study a species is to observe the members of the species in their natural environment over a period of time. And this is called ethology. Ethologists look for fixed action patterns in a species in response to similar external stimuli. So if you get an environmental condition, say, for example, with human beings, a man sees a female shape, and that without any thought at all produces an emotional response in him. And in some animals, they respond to a color or a shape, as the humans do. And in some animals, if the thing looks enough like a female, it will try to mate with it, even though it isn't a female, and it can't stop the behavior. So this is an environmentally stimulated fixed action pattern. So this studying this phenomena enables psychologists to predict what likely behavioural responses are going to happen in any given situation. Of great significance for humans is the difference between our modern environment and the evolutionary environment in which our behavioural tendencies evolved. In other words, we have changed our environment at a vastly faster rate than our evolved psychological mechanisms can change and adapt. And no other species has managed to do this so far. Now, looking at evolved psychological mechanisms, an evolved psychological mechanism is a behavioural capacity that is either directly or indirectly adaptive, that is, the result of natural or sexual selection. And you might remember what natural selection is. That's where a particular mutation turns out to be useful in some future crisis, and the members of the species with that mutation tend to produce more, and those who don't have that mutation produce less. And over time, that mutation gets passed on to more and more and more of the species. Sexual selection is where the female chooses a particular type of male, and a particular type of male becomes preferred by all the females, and those male traits get passed on and become even more pronounced with time. One of the fundamental premises of evolutionary psychology is that the mind largely consists of evolved psychological mechanisms, each one performing a particular function. So they see the mind as simply a collection of these mechanisms, which, as we will find out, really don't know of each other's existence and can behave quite independently of each other and get in the way of each other. Adaptive behaviours involve a combination of innate and learned components, as we said. They involve an innate predisposition to learn particular behaviours in particular ecological and social contexts. So in other words, we have the predisposition first. It gets activated in a particular ecological or social situation. And once we sort of practice this for a while, we get to learn new tricks, new ways of doing it. So in a particular lifetime, we start out with the basic tendency, but we modify it through experience. Evolutionary psychology has been called human ethology. Evolutionary psychologists treat humans as another species of mammal. Knowing how behaviour has evolved in non-human species can help us understand how it might have evolved in our species. So by looking at other species and saying, well, this happens there, this happens in that species under these circumstances, then it's likely that the same will happen in the human species, and the way that it evolved will be under similar conditions. Now, looking at human ethology, the basic assumption of ethologists is that animal behaviours have both innate and learned components. They study how animal behaviours are, number one, generated, number two, regulated. They study which components are modifiable by learning and which are not modifiable. Ethologists study how behaviours develop during a life cycle of an animal and what the evolutionary context and constraints were that might have shaped that behaviour. They use this knowledge to formulate predictions about the development and evolution of behaviour in similar contexts. Evolutionary psychology is the discovery and investigation of evolved psychological mechanisms, that is, behavioural and cognitive adaptions using empirical methods. So in other words, they don't sit in the lounge room, in the lounge chair, thinking about how things are, how things should go. They actually get out there and study them. And they use various methods of getting out there and taking a look at human beings and what human beings are up to. And fixed action patterns are primarily all or none responses to a specific stimuli. In other words, once it's initiated, then the behaviour will continue regardless of whether the stimuli stays present or doesn't stay present. And there are also these fixed action patterns are highly stereotyped. In other words, they're pretty similar between members of a species and between species. And often they are species specific. In other words, some behaviours are only occur in a particular species. And closely related species exhibit similar fixed action patterns. And this happens a lot between chimpanzees and humans. Many of our basic human tendencies can be observed in chimpanzees. And these fixed action patterns are related to similar behaviours in ancestral species, indicating that they have evolved through natural selection. So in other words, evolutionary psychologists work back from what they see now and sort of say, well, how did this evolve in the past? What sort of environmental conditions were necessary for this particular behavior to be adaptive? Fixed action patterns are triggered by a thing called sign stimuli, which are specific cues and events in the environment that an animal can perceive and react to. So in order to have the reaction, the animal must see these signs. And sometimes sign stimuli are referred to as releases. In other words, they release the behavior. They release an animal to perform a behavior that is being driven by internal physiological mechanisms. And a good one is the maternal instinct. I haven't experienced myself, but I have heard that if you put a young baby in the arms of a healthy woman, then the chances are, whether she is actually the mother or not, she will begin to feel maternal feelings towards this child. And that is a fixed action pattern, and the baby is the sign stimuli. So all the features of the baby, usually it's a big head, small body, large eyes, little hands, little feet. All these things act as a stimuli for the evolved psychological mechanism in the woman, which we call the mothering instinct or maternal instinct. Now, these sign stimuli do not usually include all of the sensory inputs impinging on us. So our sensory, nervous and motor systems use a perceptual filter. That is biased towards particular patterns of activity and extracts and enhances these features from our overall sensory input. And a good example of this is when a man and a woman fall in love. They become blind to everything except what is necessary to be in love and do all the things that people in love do. And anything else, any other aspect of each other is completely ignored. They're filtered out. So in other words, only the aspects that are going to get those two people to procreate, in other words, to reproduce and raise the children together, are going to be seen. And the end product is the response is, or the fixed action pattern is, falling in love. So the degree to which our perceptual filters can be affected by extraneous sensory input and the degree to which we react to the sign stimuli is directly related to the fitness effects of detecting versus ignoring such inputs. So that's a convoluted way of saying that, as I just said, the things that are going to put us off falling in love with this person are ignored. Only the things that are going to switch on the in love response are going to be seen. So in sensory inputs that increase the reproductive fitness of our ancestors are more easily detected and reacted to than sensory inputs that did not. So in other words, the people who raised their children, and then their children bred and raised their children, the things that got them going and the things that kept them going are the things that will be passed on. And any other thing in the environment that isn't related to reproduction and raising children tends to be relegated to the back seat. The content of the triggering sign stimuli determines our behavioral response as a result of decision rules wired into our sensory, nervous and motor systems. So that's a convoluted way of saying there are rules about how we respond and to what things we respond. And these decision rules can be modified by experience if the animal lives long enough. And human species certainly live long enough, and we can modify. For example, if you think about the sort of person you would have fallen in love with when you were 20, and then you think what sort of person you fall in love with when you're 50 or 60, then I think you'll find that the sensory input you're getting from those people is quite different. So, yeah. The human fixed action patterns differ from other species in the degree to which their decision rules are modifiable by learning and experience. So the advantage we have over other species is that we are more able to modify and learn, or learn and modify from experience. And a lot of that is due to, well, we have a much more powerful brain than most other species in terms of the complexity of the things we can compute. In other words, the complexity of our brain seems to be greater than other species, and this gives us an advantage. Also, we have self-consciousness or self-awareness. So we are aware of ourselves. We can look at ourselves. We can stand outside ourselves and look back. And we don't know any other species that does that. And if we can do that, if we can see ourselves in action, then we can say, well, that was a pretty dumb thing to do. I won't do that again. Yeah. And then we modify our behavior. Now, these neural networks that we are talking about get called mental modules. And we'll say more about that now. So our evolved psychological mechanisms produce responses that maximize personal survival. So that's what they're for. The reason we have these evolved psychological mechanisms is to help us survive, reproduce, and also be altruistic in our evolutionary environment. In other words, as we saw in previous parts of the course, group survival was more important than individual survival. In other words, it was the evolution of the group that was more important than the evolution of the individual. And the reason for that is that a group can accomplish much more than an individual can. And it's a bit like if you get a bundle of sticks, and if you take one stick and you break it over your knee, it'll crack relatively easily. If you tie all the bundle together and you got all those sticks hanging together and you put it over your knee, you'll crack your knee before you crack the bundle of sticks. So today our minds consist of multiple evolved psychological mechanisms that may or may not be adaptive in today's physical and social environment. So just because we have these things doesn't mean that today they're a good thing to have. In fact, quite the opposite. And we'll say more about that later. So it's not a question of what is right, what is wrong. It's not a question of will these things make me happy or not make me happy. It's only a question of survival in our evolutionary environment. So whatever helped us survive and reproduce in our evolutionary environment, that's what we carry with us today. And in today's world, these things may not be acceptable. Okay, these are difficulties with which an evolved psychological mechanism can be modified. Depends on a large extent how much of the behavior it produces is learned and how much is an innate fixed action pattern. But what that really means is that not all behaviors are equal. In other words, some behaviors have a large innate component and some behaviors have not quite so large. So it's a question of how big is the environmental component and how big is the innate component. And the bigger the environmental component of the behavior, then the more likely we are to modify it or learn to act differently. The more innate a behavior is, the longer it takes to modify because its genetic component has a larger influence than its learned component. So it depends upon which has the largest influence, the genetic or the learned. Short-lived species generally do not modify their behavior because they have less time to change the learned component of their evolved psychological mechanisms. There's insects that live for only a few hours, few days. They're not going to change one little bit. They're going to take wing, they're going to come out of their cocoon, take wing, flutter around for a while, find a mate, copulate, and then die. And in that time, there won't be a lot of modified behavior going on. Long-lived species can achieve relatively greater modification because of the greater time available for learning. And human beings are among the longest lived, maybe not the longest lived, but among the longest lived. Evolved psychological mechanisms are properties of our sensory, nervous, and motor systems. So it's not just in our brain, in our mind, it's also in our body as well. So our behaviors involve thoughts and actions. And these sensory, nervous, and motor systems generate adaptive behavior in specific environmental circumstances. We have to bear in mind that even if we have an evolved psychological mechanism, it won't come into play unless there is an environmental condition that stimulates it. And a good example of this, I mentioned last time, I think, was the warrior mental network in a man. Most men will go through life, and this module, evolved psychological mechanism, or neural network, will never be activated because they will never be in the environmental situation that requires them to use their warrior module. And these properties have been shaped by differential survival and reproduction in our evolutionary past. So whatever the properties are, or the behaviors that we're looking at, it's a question of how many people with that particular mutation, survived and reproduced, and how many didn't. Our evolutionary past is referred to as the evolutionary environment of adaptation. So that's something to remember. That's one of those catchphrases that will come up quite often. It's the evolutionary environment of adaptation. So all of this occurred in our evolutionary environment of adaptation. Much of the activity of the nervous system in producing evolved psychological mechanisms is non-conscious and appears to be very simple and straightforward. And just remind you that most people would probably use the word unconscious. And the reason I use the word non-conscious is because unconscious has a sort of psychoanalytic aura to it. It's as if we would normally be conscious of these things, but we have buried them out of our consciousness. We've sort of pushed them out for our whatever survival defense. But that's not the way it works. In fact, it's quite normal for about 90% of what's going on in our brain to be non-conscious. In other words, we don't have access to it with the conscious part of our mind, the prefrontal cortex. And that is not a problem. It's not something's gone wrong. That's the way we were designed. It's the design feature. So all of this evolved psychological mechanism stuff is going on mostly in your non-conscious mind. In fact, I'd say 99.999% in the non-conscious mind. Such apparent simplicity, like looking at it from the outside, is misleading. Most evolved psychological mechanisms require complex computation using multiple decision rules, which are wired into our neural networks. Remembering that a network is a network, exactly that, it's a network. It's a bundle of units in the brain, all connected to each other and interconnected and connecting with other parts. So there's signals flashing all over the inside of our head in order to make one of these evolved psychological mechanisms come into play. Now, different neural networks have become specialized for producing specific evolved psychological mechanisms under specific environmental conditions. A condition that is sometimes referred to as massive modularity. So when you've got all this firing going on in your brain, quite complex, they call that massive modularity. You don't have to remember that term. It's just of interest. The activities of these modules are not necessarily coordinated nor congruent. So in other words, it's not impossible for a person to be in two minds, as it were, and you've probably experienced that quite a lot, maybe 4 or 5 times today, that you have different thoughts and different feelings about the same event. You know, on the one hand, you'll be like this, on the other hand, you'll be like that. And if push comes to shove, you may in 1 minute behave this way towards it, and in another minute behave a different way towards it. And that's because these modules don't coordinate with each other. They stand alone in terms of carrying out the particular behavior that they're designed to produce. So the complexity of human behavior stems from competing demands of modules that evolved with different decision rules. And we bear in mind that, like I said, about 90% of what's going on in our brain is in the non-conscious part, about 10% in the conscious part. Some of this stuff will come into the conscious part, but it's a very small amount compared to what's going on in the non-conscious part. Now, many evolved psychological mechanisms were shaped by natural and sexual selection in the evolutionary environment of adaptation, therefore may be no longer adaptive. In other words, we have changed the environment. We've changed the environment faster than nature could ever change the environment. So it stands to reason that the things that helped us survive in the evolutionary environment of adaptation may not be working for us now. To sum up, the behavioral tendencies of modern humans were adaptations to our environmental, evolutionary environment of adaptation, as we said. And natural selection allowed helpful behavior adaptations to proliferate, and non-helpful ones died out. So any mutation that would prove to be adaptive multiplied and grew, and those that weren't adaptive in that particular environment didn't. Now, it's all quite possible that the mutation that helped us in one environment is of no help in the next environmental change that goes on. But there will be other mutations that will come through that will help us in that one. And we're a bit in that situation at the moment where we got our evolved psychological mechanisms that don't fit the world that we've created. So we have to try to change them, modify them very quickly to match the environment that we live in now. And as you can see from the number of jails, schools, courses, life coaches, personal coaches that are out there, all trying to produce change in individuals and enable them to adapt better to the environment that we've created. So our behaviour is partly due to inherited behavioural tendencies and partly due to individual learning, as we saw. So whether a particular inherited behaviour tendency is activated or not depends on environmental stimuli at the time. So in other words, don't forget that we're not like working on instinct alone. Our instincts, as it were, don't get switched on unless the environment throws the switch. So it has to be an environmental stimuli to throw the switch. And it doesn't mean that these so-called or innate behaviours can't be modified. They can be modified, however, not easily. And it requires quite a bit of knowledge and self-awareness in order to modify them. Evolutionary psychologists use ethology to study human species. And this involves observing humans in their natural habitat. It involves noting predictable behavioural patterns in response to similar environmental stimuli. Now, humans have the capacity to modify the behaviour in response to environmental stimuli, and this is facilitated by knowing how evolved psychological mechanisms work and why they work. And that's why you're doing this course. In other words, at the end of this course, apart from having much food for thought, you will also should have a better capacity, because you know a bit more, and have a better capacity for modifying some of these evolved psychological mechanisms that you have. And also the human capacity for self-awareness, being able to stand back and look at yourself makes all of this possible. And finally, although many of our evolved psychological mechanisms may seem immoral, unethical, unjust, and unfair in our modern enlightened way of thinking, they are the result of behavioral modifications or mutations that enabled us to survive in a hostile evolutionary environment. Now, should our environment become hostile again, and there's no reason to say that it won't, if it ever became hostile again, these unacceptable unacceptable behavioral traits may be needed to ensure the survival of species. So if we get rid of all the things that we don't like about other people, get them to change, if possible, use genetic modification to change people, then if we got back to a hostile environment again, then all of those people that we've changed genetically to make them more acceptable to our social situation, they'll all die out because they don't have what it takes to survive in a hostile environment. Okay, so that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed it. I did. And I'll see you next time.